Hello, hello, mod creators. Let me go ahead and go through some new and interesting information that I have come across by banging my head against a wall and researching. So basically, I have come up with a new, better, easier, and quicker to set up method that more accurately simulates physics. So let's pretend that we're setting this up from the base, and I'll show you how to do it. First things first, remember how I said you need to create a virtual bone for everything? You do not. Goodbye, virtual bones. So it saves that step. You don't have to make any virtual bones. You just import your skeleton, and you're all good. In your asset here, if you say, let me go ahead and delete this one. Actually, never mind. I'll take care of that later. If you right-click your skeletal mesh, you can go to Create Physics Asset, Create and Assign, and it'll bring up a little window like this. You want your minimum bone size to be very, very small, almost 0. And I'll actually go ahead and set this up for you guys. Primitive type should be sphere, just so it's simple. Or you could even do box as well. It doesn't matter. Make sure walk past small bones is unchecked, and then you'll want to create asset. So 99% of the work will be done here in the physics asset. So the first thing I like to do is delete everything. And then you click on show all bones here, and then go and manually select everything that you want to generate bodies for. Now, if it did generate all the bodies correctly, great, you can use that. But I find, especially if you have like a root to all of your chains that doesn't actually have any mesh weighted to it, it often just skips those. So I don't need anything for base, but I do want left root and all of its children, and right root and all of its children. So that should be this and all of its children, and that one and all of its children. So you get all that. And once they're selected, go over to the tools over here, and it should keep your settings. If not, put them back in, and then add bodies. There we go. So now that the bodies are added, one thing that I like to do, which is not necessary, is size these down. So this is the scale. You hit the R key, or you can click this up here, and just scale down the spheres as small as they can go. And because we're not actually going to be working with bodies, to be most efficient, you don't work with collisions and stuff. Anyways, next thing you want to do is go ahead and select your root bones. So I have both of these here, and set the physics type to kinematic. The other thing you're going to want to do on these root bones is set the mass to something high. Now, this is where it's going to change for basically depending on how stiff you want. There is a stiffness setting that you can find somewhere in the constraints, but it doesn't work as well as you would hope. I found that mass is the way to go. So the chain length here is not very long. It has a max chain length of 5, or technically 6, I guess. So I'm going to put my weight for the roots at 1000. Now, again, you may want to tinker with this a bit to get your desired stiffness. And then we go down the chain. So I'm going to select all of my 1 bones. And set their mass to 100. So the first one was 1,000, next one's 100. I like to go, like, this particular mesh is kind of stiff, and I want it to be stiff. So I tend to go, as I go down the chain, increment the mass by a multiple of 10. That may not be the case for you. You may want to just half it. So a multiple of 2. It really just depends. So anyways, we selected all the 1 bones in the chain, set the mass, set your physics type to simulated this time, and then angular damping. This is important. This is the other value that you're gonna modify a bit and tinker with to get it as you like it. I like to set it at 100 for this. For other things, I might set it a little lower, but what it prevents is like vibrating, especially on like lower values when the bone is trying to reach, like you're going to want to put a value here. I would probably lowest go to 10. A good kind of default might be 30 or 50, but I'm doing 100 on these. So now let's go to 2. Wait, did I set these? Yeah, okay. 2, 2, 2. I bet you I could just, yeah. Okay. So the last ones were 100, so we're going to set these to 10. Simulated. And an angular dampening of 100. Let's go to 3. So the last one was 10, so this one will be 1. Simulated. 100. Here we go. Then there's 4. 0.1. Simulated. 100. And 5. So, another thing I want to talk about is the last bone in your chain. The last bone in your chain, the lowest mass that you'll probably want to go is 0.01. The closer that your mass is to 0, the harder that the physics simulation engine, the harder time it has calculating correctly how like much something should wobble or what happens when it violates its constraint limits. So that's probably the lowest you'll want to go on your final bone. So you could work backwards from your final bone just so that you know you won't hit that lower limit. But 0.01 is fine for the final bone in a chain. Okay, so now that you have all of that, that is the body settings completed. I ignore all of this stuff down here. So now let's look at constraints. So I select all of my bodies here and then select the constraints. Thankfully, the constraints are something that you can set all together. There's not really much individuality here, unless you want there to be. So good for you. So the first thing we're going to do is enable projection. Projection helps with stability. I don't want these things moving linearly a lot, so I'm going to put the tolerance at 0.1. And for the projection angular tolerance, I'm going to put that at 10. And that is because I'm already thinking ahead, and I know that the swing limits that I'm going to implement are only going to be at 5. So 10 should allow it to go a little bit outside of its constraint, but also hard limit it to not violate it too much. So this will change depending on how much you want to limit your swing. You'll probably want it to be a little bit higher than your swing, like maybe 10 higher, or even just 5 higher would be fine. So anyways, now let's move to swing. We're going to do limited on those and then locked on twist. I do not want them to twist. And we'll set those to 5. You can see these are starting to look a lot better. The other thing that you're going to want to do, and I made that appear by hitting E while my mouse is in this visual section, is you want to align these. Now, if you have everything selected, you should be able to just do something like that. And like that. Yeah, perfect. And align them all at once. Makes your job easier. Okay, next part. Self-constraint. This is something that you need to look at. I'm not going to touch it because I actually like them being able to violate the constraint a little bit, and then be forced harder and harder back to get in within its constraint. But if you absolutely do not want it going beyond its constraint, this is where you do that. Last but not least, easiest part, twist and swing, and you set the force here. This is the other value that you're going to be modifying the most, will be the strength of that. Try not to make this too high. If you're finding that it's still not strong enough or whatever, I would make sure to go back to the bodies and look at the angular damping. So yeah, you're not gonna want to put this at like 1,000,000 or 100,000 or something. Maybe in specific use cases, maybe like 10,000, but I tend to stick around 1 to 5,000. So yeah, you do that. And then you have your physics asset. So that's all you need to do on the physics asset side. And the head skeleton side, you don't need to make virtual bones or anything anymore. Now let's take a look at the animation blueprint. So I'm just going to go from scratch here. First, make sure that the animation blueprint that you likely copied from the physics example in base assets is actually parented to the correct skeleton. So you would like right click this, assign skeleton, and assign it to whatever you're using. The other thing is if it doesn't have eyes and you don't need to worry about blinking, you can go ahead and disconnect this here, like I have. If not, just leave it. Like if they do have eyes, just leave it. And this is blink control, so I basically have just bypassed that, and just gone like straight to the user offsets. So this is the old stuff that you had to do. where you had to go and manually set every source bone with the virtual bones and all that crap. Goodbye. You don't need to do that anymore. You just need to do this. Which should already be there, already set up. So the only thing that you probably will need to edit would be this, the override world gravity Z. So this depends again on your desired effect. Most times, however, you're going to want to set this to 0, so no gravity. Especially if it is something like this and the chains are going upwards, or they're stiff, you know. You'll probably want to set that to 0 most times, 9 times out of 10. There may be some instances where you may want some gravity, so use your best judgment there, but it's best to keep it off. That way it's not fighting with two different forces. So like the force from the constraint and then the force from gravity. You turn that off and it will not jiggle as much. Now, I think that covers just about everything. However, if you are curious, I guess you could look at it yourself, but I'll go ahead and explain why I put the settings as they are in the physics asset. Oh, also, your physics asset may look slightly differently, like I may unexpose that pen, and don't worry, it's normal. Okay, so now this is for modders who may want to customize their own or whatever, which is not typical. First thing you do is force disable collision between constraint bodies. So that doing this here is doing the same thing before, and it just ensures that like you're not missing a bone, and it cuts out an entire step for the creation of the physics asset. So that's time saver. And then the other thing I like to do is enable automatic scale fixing after simulation. If things are a little bit wonky with translation, you may want to do no translation, but I don't like translation, so I do want it to fix translation as well. So that's why I've done this top one. And that's pretty much it. And putting all of those settings together really kind of makes it come out as I want it to. So we will take a peek in game at this stiffness as well as the correct calculation, because you may notice for some of the ears that I showed in my previous videos, if they're even still up, I may remove them just so I'm not spreading the wrong information about stuff, that they would glitch a little bit when you like crouch down. No longer does that. It carries the momentum properly, but it doesn't like lag behind and translate outside of where it should. So you see, it still has that little bit of movement, but these are generally stiff. Yeah, stiff movement is actually harder to get than wiggly, which is funny. But anyways, that's how to properly set up a physics asset with your animation blueprint. Good luck.